the emotional affair that led to self-discovery. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would fall into something so messy, so confusing, so unexpectedly life-altering that it would shift the trajectory of everything I thought I knew about myself. My life had been carefully arranged, like books on a shelf, each chapter accounted for, each emotion neatly categorized and tucked away. There was no room for surprises. I didn't welcome chaos, I avoided it like a stubborn shadow. And yet, that's exactly how she came into my life. Like a storm I never predicted, a chapter I never wrote, and a heartbeat I didn't know I had. I met her in a moment I didn't believe was significant. We were two strangers sitting across from each other in a shared office space, the kind of sterile room that smelled like printer ink and microwave lunches. Nothing remotely romantic about it. She was there for a freelance gig, and I was finishing up the last stretch of a soul-crushing deadline. I had no interest in small talk, no patience for new people, and certainly no reason to believe that this brief intersection would become anything more than a polite nod exchanged at the coffee machine. But she had this habit of humming to herself when she worked. Not loudly, just enough that it cut through the hum of fluorescent lights and the tap of keyboards. It was an old melody, something nostalgic I couldn't place, but it tugged at something in me I hadn't felt in a while. I started looking forward to it. Isn't that strange? To be drawn to something so small, so trivial, and yet find comfort in it like a familiar tune on a rainy afternoon. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just a bit of human warmth in an otherwise cold space. But then I found myself timing my coffee breaks with hers, making excuses to ask questions about projects I wasn't even involved in, picking up on the way she curled her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, or how she tapped her pen 3 times before writing anything down. I noticed everything, and noticing became obsession. She wasn't beautiful in the way magazines define it. She was something different, real, flawed, with eyes that told stories even when her mouth didn't. She laughed with her whole face. She listened without interrupting. And she had this way of making you feel like what you were saying mattered, even when it didn't. It was terrifying, because I was already in a relationship, one that had lasted years, built on mutual comfort, routine, and the kind of love that doesn't ignite but simply simmers. There were no fireworks, but there was stability, no passion but no fights either. We had a rhythm: wake up, breakfast, work, dinner, sleep. Repeat. I thought that was enough. I told myself it was. After all, who really needs butterflies when you have a shared Netflix account and a combined grocery list? But with her, it was different. I started to feel alive again. Like I had color in my cheeks and blood in my veins. It wasn't even about sex or romance at first. It was about feeling seen. About being reminded that I was still someone interesting. Someone capable of being curious, witty, spontaneous. Someone I hadn't met in years. We never crossed the line, not physically. But emotionally, that line was obliterated. I began to share things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. Childhood memories, fears, dreams I had buried under layers of responsibility. She did the same, and with each shared secret, we built something delicate, dangerous, and utterly addictive. My partner began to notice subtle shifts in my behavior, late-night texts I tried to hide, excuses that sounded rehearsed, the way I smiled differently, like I had a joke no one else was in on. I lied. Not big lies, just the kind that stack on top of each other until they build a fortress between two people. Just a work friend? She's married. It's nothing, but it was everything. I found myself rushing to work in the mornings, hoping to catch her before anyone else did, staying late just to be around her a little longer, taking mental snapshots of the way she furrowed her brow when concentrating, or the way her voice dipped into a whisper when talking about something that mattered. It was magnetic, irresistible, and doomed. Because reality always comes knocking eventually. I remember the day everything shifted. It was raining, of course. It always is in these kinds of stories. The office was half empty, most people working remotely. She and I had stayed behind, both using the excuse of a deadline. She made tea, I brought snacks. We talked about music, then about loss, then about the kind of life we each imagined if we could start over. She said something about wanting to move to a cabin in the woods and live off the grid. I said, I wanted to write again. Really write, not just copy for Solace clients. Then she looked at me, and I knew there was no going back. Not from that look, not from that moment. It was a kiss that never happened, but it might as well have. The air between us pulsed with everything unsaid. We didn't touch, but we had already crossed every line that mattered. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. My partner asked if I was okay. I said I was just tired. She offered me tea. I said no thanks. The guilt was beginning to eat away at the high. That's the thing they don't tell you about emotional affairs. They feel innocent at first, almost noble, two people connecting on a deep level. But the erosion is slow and quiet, like water dripping on stone. It doesn't feel like damage until the crack splits wide open. I began to pull away from both of them. I ghosted the woman who had made me feel alive, telling myself it was for the best. I became colder to the partner I lived with, telling myself I was protecting her from a truth she didn't deserve. I lived in a half-life, paralyzed by indecision. Every missed her. But I also hated myself for what I had become. A coward, a liar, a man split down the middle. The worst part was knowing I had done this. No one else. I had orchestrated my own downfall, and I didn't know how to stop it. Time passed. Not enough to heal, just enough to numb. She eventually stopped humming. Eventually stopped making eye contact. Eventually stopped being there at all. I found out she had taken a permanent position elsewhere. No goodbye, no explanation, just absence. It was poetic in a way. The kind of ending that suits stories like ours. Open-ended, aching, unresolved. I stayed with my partner. We tried to patch things up. Therapy, honest talks, renewed intimacy. But there was always something missing. A ghost between us. A song I could no longer hear. And every now and then, when I walk past a stranger who hums to themselves, or hear a tune I can't quite place, my heart tightens just for a second. Because I remember what it felt like to fall in love by accident. And what it cost me? I thought cutting ties would bring clarity. That if I buried the memory deep enough, smothered it under layers of routine and responsibility, I'd forget the warmth in her eyes or the way her voice softened when she talked about things that mattered. But it didn't work like that. The problem with emotional entanglements is that they don't unravel cleanly. They linger in your bones, in the pauses between sentences, in the way you find yourself staring too long at nothing, wondering how someone who was never truly yours could leave such an imprint. Life carried on as it always does, with or without my consent. My partner and I settled into something that resembled stability again. We went on weekend trips, laughed at predictable sitcoms, debated over takeout menus. We tried. We genuinely did. She sensed something had changed, but she didn't press. Maybe she feared the answer. Or maybe she thought pretending things were fine would eventually make them so. I played along, grateful for the silence, resentful of the comfort. It was the limbo I had chosen, and now I had to live in it. But the human heart is a stubborn thing. It doesn't obey timelines. I would find her, the other her, in the pages of books, in the lyrics of songs, in the strangers who shared her haircut or wore the same perfume. 1,000 little ghosts following me everywhere. I tried distracting myself. Took on new projects, joined a gym, started journaling again. But nothing could replicate that feeling. That electric current of being seen, understood, wanted. I wasn't in love with her anymore. Or at least that's what I told myself. But I hadn't fallen back in love with the life I had either. I was hovering, suspended between two truths, the one I lived and the one I lost. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. I was walking home from work, lost in thought, when I passed by a bookstore we had once talked about visiting together. She'd mentioned it in passing, said it had this hidden corner filled with antique poetry books and a cat that slept near the register. On impulse, I went in, not to look for her, I knew she wouldn't be there, but maybe to find something that reminded me why it all mattered. The shop was quiet, dimly lit, with the smell of old paper hanging heavy in the air. And there, on a shelf marked "Letters Never Sent," I found a small leather-bound notebook wedged awkwardly between two volumes of forgotten fiction. Curiosity won. I picked it up. Inside were handwritten notes. Entries from strangers, perhaps customers, who had once poured their hearts into anonymous pages. Stories of missed chances, apologies never made, confessions left unsaid. It was beautiful, raw, real. And something in me broke open. I bought the notebook, took it home, and started writing. Not for anyone else, just for me. I wrote about the first time I noticed her, about the way she looked when she laughed, about the guilt, the yearning, the ache. I poured everything into those pages like blood into soil, hoping something new would grow from it. It became a ritual. Every night I wrote a little more, and slowly things began to shift. I started noticing my partner again. Really noticing. The way she rubbed her temples when tired. How she always made my favorite tea without asking. How she still believed in us, even when I had faltered. She didn't know about the notebook, about the emotional affair, about the way I had strayed in silence. But she knew something had hurt me. She once said, "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." I nodded, but I didn't tell her. Couldn't, not yet. The guilt wasn't just about her, it was about me, who I had become, who I had let myself be. The months crawled by. Seasons shifted. I kept writing, and somewhere between heartbreak and healing, I began to ask myself the hardest questions. What was I truly missing? Was it her, or the version of myself that existed when I was with her? The man who felt alive, vibrant, capable of risk. Had she really been the answer, or just the spark that revealed everything I had suppressed for years? That realization was like cold water. Maybe I hadn't loved her at all. Maybe I had simply loved how I felt around her. Because for the first time in years, someone made me question the path I was on. And I needed that. Desperately. It made me realize that somewhere along the way, I had stopped evolving. I had chosen comfort over growth, safety over authenticity. And that choice, repeated daily, had deadened something vital in me. She had been a mirror, reflecting back the parts of me I had ignored. But she wasn't my salvation, I was. So I started making changes. Small ones. I began waking up earlier. Went on walks without my phone. Took a creative writing class on weekends. I stopped saying yes to things I didn't want, and more importantly, stopped saying no to the things I did. I asked my partner questions I hadn't asked in years, about her dreams, her regrets, her fears. We talked, truly talked, for hours. Not about us, but about who we were as individuals. It was strange, like meeting someone new inside a person I thought I already knew completely. One night, after a particularly long conversation about her childhood, I told her I wanted to travel. Not a vacation, something longer. A trip to somewhere I'd never been, just to breathe different air and remember who I was without context. She surprised me. She didn't argue. She just said, "Then go. But come back with a story worth telling." So I did. I took a 3-week trip to a quiet town by the sea, rented a small room with creaky floors and ocean views, and wrote. I wrote until my fingers cramped. Until I cried without knowing why. Until I laughed at memories I thought I had lost. I didn't call anyone. Didn't check emails. I just existed. And in that stillness, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. When I returned, I brought back the notebook, now filled from cover to cover. I didn't read it to her, but I left it on our bookshelf, next to our favorite novels. She never asked. She just smiled, as if she already knew. Life resumed, but not as it was before. We weren't pretending anymore. We were rebuilding. Brick by brick, with truth as mortar. Some days were hard, others felt effortless, but at least we were awake, present. And I had her hand in mine, not because I needed it to feel whole, but because I wanted it there. Months later, I received a postcard, no return address. Just a photo of a cabin in the woods covered in snow with the words, "I hope you're writing. I hope you're happy." I stared at it for a long time, then placed it inside the notebook. It felt right to leave it there. Not as a wound, but as a scar. A reminder of who I had been, who I almost became, and who I chose to be instead. Because love doesn't always arrive to stay. Sometimes it crashes into your life just long enough to shatter your reflection, forcing you to piece it back together with clearer eyes. And if you're lucky, you don't just find someone new. You find yourself. I didn't expect peace to be so quiet. I had always imagined healing as something loud, something triumphant. Like breaking free from chains or running breathless through the streets in the rain, arms raised, heart pounding, cinematic and sudden. But in truth, it was nothing like that. It was slow, silent. So gradual I almost didn't notice it was happening. Like waking up one morning and realizing the ache had dulled, that the space inside my chest, once occupied by grief, was now filled with stillness. Not joy, not yet, but stillness. And that was enough. The postcard stayed on the shelf, untouched. I never replied. I didn't know where to send anything, and even if I had, I don't think I would have written back. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already said everything in that notebook. I had let go the only way I knew how. And somehow, in doing that, I had made room for something else, something better. But letting go of her didn't mean I stopped being haunted by what she had awakened in me. Because that's the thing about emotional affairs. They reveal what's missing, and now that I had seen it, I couldn't unsee it. I began to look at my entire life through that lens. My job, my friends, even the way I spent weekends. It was like someone had switched on a blacklight and suddenly all the invisible cracks were glowing. I realized how much of myself I had handed over to obligation. I wasn't miserable. I had a good life by every standard. But it wasn't on mine. It was built on a series of convenient choices, on doing what was expected, on avoiding discomfort at all costs. I had become excellent at functioning, terrible at living. My partner noticed the shift. At first, she welcomed it. My openness, my sudden interest in long conversations and quiet mornings. But as the months wore on, she began to sense the restlessness beneath it all. I was searching for something I couldn't quite name, and it scared her. I think part of her was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the inevitable confession or breakdown or betrayal. But I never gave it. Not because I was hiding, but because I genuinely didn't know what I wanted yet. And it felt cruel to dismantle something just because I was lost. Still, the distance crept in. Not all at once. In small ways, less laughter, more silence. The kind that's too heavy to ignore, but too vague to confront. We tiptoed around it like glass on the floor, both aware of the cracks, neither willing to step down hard enough to shatter them. One evening, she asked me what I was writing. I had started a new notebook, different from the one that held the past. This one was filled with fragments, ideas, thoughts, unfinished letters to people I hadn't seen in years. I told her it was just reflections. She nodded, not pressing. But her eyes held a sadness I couldn't touch. That night, I realized I was grieving something that wasn't gone yet. Us. We were still here, technically. Still waking up in the same bed. Still folding laundry together. Still debating over what to cook on Fridays. But something essential had shifted. We were no longer reaching for each other. We were coexisting. Parallel. Close, but not connected. I asked her one morning out of nowhere, "Are you happy?" She looked at me for a long time before answering. Then she said, "I don't know. I think I used to be." That sentence hit me harder than any accusation could have, because I realized she wasn't blaming me. She was just tired. Like I was. Tired of pretending the gap wasn't growing. Tired of patching over wounds instead of healing them. Tired of being loyal to a version of us that no longer existed. We didn't argue. There was no dramatic fight, no slammed doors or screaming. Just two people quietly acknowledging a truth they'd tried to avoid. Over the following weeks, we talked more openly than we had in years. About who we were when we met and how much we'd changed. About how love sometimes turns into something else. Something softer, sadder, still meaningful but no longer sustainable. We cried, hugged, laughed even. There was no villain in this story, just the slow erosion of compatibility, and perhaps a deep love that had matured into friendship, no longer fierce enough to carry the weight of partnership. We decided to separate, gently, respectfully. No drama, no third party involved. Just the understanding that holding on for the sake of history does more harm than letting go for the sake of honesty. I moved out, found a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, just mine. I filled it with plants and second-hand furniture and books stacked on the floor. It was chaotic, imperfect, and exactly what I needed. In that space, I began to rebuild, not from scratch, but from truth. I didn't chase new love. I didn't download dating apps or force social outings. I spent time with myself, getting reacquainted with the person I had neglected for years. I took long walks with no destination, sat in cafes with my notebook, wrote without worrying whether it was good. I reached out to old friends, reconnected with parts of my past I'd abandoned in the name of adulthood. And slowly, I began to feel real again. Not defined by someone else, not weighed down by regret, just present, alive. And then, one afternoon, as I was walking through the park near my place, I saw her, and the woman from the office. She was sitting alone on a bench, sketching in a pad. Her hair was shorter. She looked different, older, maybe, or just more settled. My heart didn't race, my knees didn't go weak, but something in me stirred, an echo, not a scream. She looked up and saw me. For a moment, we just stared. Then she smiled. A soft, familiar smile that held no weight, no questions. Just acknowledgement. I walked over. We talked. About nothing and everything. She'd moved away for a while. Taken time off. Found herself teaching art part-time and loving it. I told her about the notebook, about the trip, about the separation. She listened just as she always had. With presence, not pity. We didn't flirt. There was no undercurrent. Just two people catching up. And when we parted, we didn't exchange numbers. No promises to stay in touch. Just a mutual understanding that whatever had existed between us had served its purpose. She had been a spark, a turning point. But the fire I built after her was my own. That evening, I sat on my balcony and watched the city breathe. I thought about all the versions of myself I had been. The dreamer, the liar, the wanderer, the partner, the coward, the seeker. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel fragmented. I felt whole. Not complete, not perfect, but whole. And maybe that's what love is supposed to do in the end. Not complete us, but reveal the parts we've forgotten, the spaces we've neglected, the voices we've silenced. And once we see them, once we remember who we really are, we have the choice to grow, to forgive, to let go, to begin again. And I had. It's strange how life continues to unfold even after you think the story has reached its natural end. I had imagined that moment on the balcony as a kind of closing chapter, a quiet acceptance that I had walked through fire and emerged intact. But endings, I've learned, are rarely clean. They trail threads behind them. Unfinished thoughts, unresolved emotions, unexpected detours. They pretend to be final but whisper of more to come. I had started to enjoy the silence of my new life. The absence of tension, of second guessing, of having to explain the way I felt or didn't feel. My apartment became my sanctuary, a space where nothing was required of me but honesty. I cooked for one. I drank coffee by the window. I read poetry aloud to no one. It was lonely, yes, but not in the aching way it had been before. This loneliness was fertile. It held space for growth, for becoming. People began to notice the change. Friends who had known me for years commented on how I seemed lighter, more present. My sister said there was something different in my voice, as if I'd finally remembered how to breathe, and maybe I had. I started volunteering once a week at a local library, helping children with reading assignments. It wasn't something I planned. It just happened after I overheard a librarian complain about being short-staffed. I raised my hand without thinking. I had no qualifications, no reason to believe I'd be good at it. But those Saturday mornings became my anchor. There was something pure about those interactions. Kids didn't care about your past, your heartbreak, your moral failures. They just wanted to know if dragons could fly or whether talking animals had jobs. I rediscovered wonder through their eyes. One little girl, Eva, was particularly quiet. Barely spoke, but every week she returned with the same book in her backpack, a worn-out copy of The Secret Garden. She never asked me to read it, just held it in her lap while we sat side by side choosing different stories. One day, I asked her why she never opened it. She shrugged. "I don't want to finish it," she whispered. "Oh, because then it's over." And there it was. That soft punch to the chest that only children can deliver. Because I understood, more than I cared to admit. I, too, had clung to something long past its usefulness, terrified of the emptiness that might follow. But endings aren't always voids. Sometimes they're invitations. Around this time, I started writing again in earnest. Not just journal entries or fragmented thoughts, but structured work. Short stories, essays, even the beginning of a novel. I didn't know if it was any good. I didn't care. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had gone dormant. The version of me that once believed in imagination, in language, in the power of expression. For years, I had been mute in my own story. Now I had a voice again. And that voice didn't sound like anyone else's. I submitted one of my pieces to a small online magazine, mostly on a dare from a friend. I didn't expect anything. When they emailed me a month later, saying they wanted to publish it, I stared at the screen for 10 full minutes before reacting. It was a quiet victory. No parade, no fanfare. Just a shift. A reminder that I could create something from the wreckage, that my past didn't disqualify me from having a future. I printed the piece and mailed it to my ex. No note, no message. Just the article, folded neatly in an envelope. I didn't know if she'd read it. I didn't need her to. But I wanted her to know that I was doing something with the pain. That it hadn't gone to waste. A week later, I received a letter in return. Her handwriting was exactly as I remembered, neat slanted, with little loops on the y's and g's. She said she'd read it 3 times. That it made her cry, that she was proud of me, that she was okay. It was the closure we never gave each other in words. And it came without blame, without bitterness. Just love, in its new form, love that no longer needed to hold, only to bless. After that, something in me shifted again. I began to move through the world with less hesitation. I said yes more often, to invitations, to new experiences, to uncertain outcomes. I started traveling, not far at first, weekend trips, nearby cities, but it felt like rediscovering the planet. I saw things differently. Every stranger became a story, every sunset a metaphor. I was hungry again, not for romance or distraction, but for meaning, for color, for presence. One rainy afternoon, I walked into a photography exhibit on impulse. I wasn't even sure what drew me in. Maybe the soft lighting, the warmth, the curiosity. Inside, the walls were lined with black and white portraits of ordinary people in extraordinary moments. An old man holding a violin on a broken staircase, a woman laughing beside a grave, a child staring into a cracked mirror. I stood in front of one particular photo for a long time. It showed a couple, elderly, dancing barefoot in a kitchen. There was flour on the floor, a rolling pin nearby, and a pie crust half made on the counter. But they weren't looking at the mess. They were looking at each other mid-laugh, lost in the kind of moment that forgets everything else exists. The caption read, "Joy. In spite of it all, I wanted that." Not perfection, not fireworks, just someone to dance with in the middle of the mess. But I wasn't chasing it. I didn't need it to feel whole. And that, perhaps, was the biggest difference between who I was and who I had become. I no longer believed that love was something you find once and keep forever in a glass box. I saw it as something fluid, something earned, chosen, nurtured. And I had learned to love myself enough not to settle for less than that. That night, I dreamed of a house with open windows and soft music playing. I was cooking, humming, the way she once did. There was laughter, light, and no one was missing. I woke up and didn't feel the usual pang of loss. Just a calm certainty that I was on the right path, that everything I had endured, every secret, every betrayal, every whispered what if, had been part of my becoming. And I wasn't finished yet? Not even close. There comes a point when reflection turns into forward motion. When the past, no matter how vivid, begins to blur at the edges and the present grows louder than memory. I hadn't reached that point intentionally. It snuck up on me, subtly, the way seasons change. Not all at once, but leaf by leaf. The grief had settled like dust on furniture, still present but no longer disruptive. And in its place there was room for new habits, new people, new ways of looking at old things. I had no plans to fall in love again. It felt like a complication I didn't need. Love had been a battlefield, a mirror, a teacher. And I was still nursing the bruises. But healing is sly. It prepares you without asking. It builds you up quietly, so that one day, you're suddenly capable of things you once thought impossible. I didn't realize I had changed until I met her. It started with a train. I was heading out of town for a short writing retreat. A last-minute decision after winning a local contest that offered free lodging for 5 days to focus on a personal project. I brought nothing but a duffel bag and a few notebooks, telling myself it would be solitary, a kind of creative cleanse. The train was half empty, gray skies outside, the rhythmic clatter of wheels humming through the cabin. I sat by the window, headphones in, writing lines I would later delete, when someone asked if the seat beside me was taken. She wore no makeup, her hair up in a loose twist, a book in one hand and a tote bag in the other. She looked familiar, like someone I might have known in another life. I nodded and moved my jacket aside. She sat without ceremony, opened her book, and didn't speak a word for the first 40 minutes. And yet, there was something magnetic about her silence. Comfortable, intentional. It didn't demand attention. It invited ease. Eventually, the train jolted, and her book slipped from her lap. I reached down, handed it back, and that was it. The beginning of something I couldn't name yet. We talked, softly at first. About books, the weather, the reason we were both traveling. She was a landscape architect, she said, taking a few days off to sketch and think. She didn't ask me many questions, and I didn't offer too many answers. It was refreshing how unforced it all was. No pressure to impress. No posturing. Just two people sharing space and time without expectation. When we arrived at the station, we didn't exchange numbers. We simply nodded a small goodbye, a polite smile, and went our separate ways. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a pleasant moment, a passing chapter. But the universe has a sense of humor. The retreat center was tucked away in the hills, a quiet property with a few scattered cabins and a communal dining hall. Writers, artists, and creatives came and went, each absorbed in their own projects. On the first evening, we were asked to gather for introductions and dinner. I walked into the hall, scanning the faces, and there she was. Again, sitting at the end of the table, sketching in a notebook, the same calm presence wrapped around her like a shawl. She saw me and smiled, something slightly wider than before. "Looks like the train wanted us to keep talking," she said. I laughed, and just like that, coincidence became continuity. Over the next few days, we shared meals, occasional walks, and long, quiet evenings under the trees. We didn't flirt, we didn't touch, but something between us began to hum, a soft frequency, steady and low. We respected each other's space. She'd disappear for hours into the woods, sketching or writing in her journal, and I'd lose myself in paragraphs I hadn't been able to write for months. And yet, we kept drifting back to one another, like leaves caught in the same current. I learned her name, Elise. She learned mine. And slowly, we learned each other. She told me about a fiancé she almost married. How the wedding was planned, the dress chosen, the invitations sent. But something inside her froze weeks before the ceremony. He was perfect, she said. Kind, loyal, safe. But I couldn't breathe. I couldn't stop imagining a life where I didn't have to shrink to fit someone else's idea of me. She called it the bravest and most selfish thing she'd ever done. And I understood, not the exact experience, but the weight of choosing authenticity over comfort. I told her about the woman in the office. The affair that wasn't physical, but left deep scars. the partner I had loved and let go, the years I had spent pretending to be okay, and the months it had taken to actually become okay. She listened without flinching. No judgment, just quiet, patient attention. It made me want to keep talking. One night, we sat under the stars, each with a glass of wine, and she said, "I think broken people make the best artists. Not because of the pain, but because they're always searching. They know what it means to ache, and they want to create something that doesn't." I didn't answer, but I thought about that sentence for hours after she went to bed. The retreat ended as all temporary things do. We packed our bags, exchanged emails, not phone numbers, and promised to stay in touch. I didn't believe it would happen. People make those promises all the time, and life sweeps them away. But she surprised me. A week later, she sent me a photo of a sketch she'd done of the hill behind the retreat cabin. "Missing the quiet," the message said. I replied with a paragraph from a short story I'd been working on. It became our rhythm. Notes, fragments, unfinished things sent back and forth like a dialogue only we could understand. Then came the inevitable moment. "Would you want to meet again?" she asked one evening. I stared at the message for a long time. Fear rose up, not the kind that signals danger, but the kind that warns of change. I had rebuilt a life of balance, and this invitation threatened to tip it again. But the difference now was that I no longer feared falling. I knew how to get up. So I said yes. We met halfway, her city not far. A weekend. Neutral territory. It wasn't a date. At least, we didn't call it that. But we lingered over coffee, wandered bookstores, shared awkward silences that didn't feel wrong. At the end of the night, we sat on a bench overlooking the river. She rested her head on my shoulder without asking. I let it stay there. And in that simple closeness, I realized how much I had changed. I no longer craved intensity. I craved clarity, but not grand gestures or dramatic passion, but presence, peace. Someone who didn't try to complete me, but simply sat beside me while I figured myself out. And she was that. Not a missing piece, a companion, a mirror, a witness. By Sunday evening, we both knew we didn't want this to be temporary, but neither of us rushed. There were no declarations, no plans to move in or label things too quickly. We chose each other gently, slowly, over time. Back home, my apartment no longer felt lonely. It felt like mine, and hers when she visited. We carved out a rhythm that honored both our independence and our connection. It wasn't perfect. We had disagreements. We misread each other. But we always returned to one truth: we wanted to understand, not win. We didn't fall in love. We grew into it. And somewhere between the laughter, the notes passed in books, the early morning phone calls, and the shared silences, I began to feel something I hadn't in years. Safe, but not bored, not stagnant, just safe to be myself. To admit when I was afraid, to dream out loud again. One afternoon, while cleaning my apartment, I found the old leather-bound notebook, the one filled with all the unsent letters, the memories, the confessions. I sat on the floor and flipped through it, page by page. It was raw, honest, full of ache and shame and yearning. But I didn't feel sad. I felt gratitude, because those pages had carried me through the storm. They had held the weight when I couldn't. And now, they were a monument, not a wound. I considered burning it, letting the past turn to ash. But instead, I tucked it back on the shelf. Because I don't believe in erasing history. I believe in learning from it. That night, Elise and I cooked dinner together. She danced barefoot in the kitchen while stirring the sauce, flour on her cheek, a tune on her lips. I watched her, heart full, and thought of that photograph in the gallery. The elderly couple dancing in a messy kitchen. Joy in spite of it all, DACA, yes. That's what we were building, and it was enough. The morning light slipped through the curtains like a quiet promise, brushing across the sheets as I woke beside Elise. Her breath was slow, steady, the rhythm of someone utterly at peace, and for a moment, I simply watched her. This woman who had walked in softly and changed everything without force. There was no drama to our love, no chaos. It wasn't made of grand declarations or impulsive passion. It was built quietly, like a cathedral of whispered truths and small, unwavering acts of care. The kind of love that didn't burn bright and fast, but deep and enduring. And yet, despite the peace, despite the calm that had become my new constant, something had begun stirring beneath the surface again. Not regret, not fear, something different. A restlessness I couldn't quite name. It started as a subtle itch. The feeling that I had more to say, more to explore. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about us. It was about me. I had come so far, rebuilt so much, that I'd almost forgotten that healing wasn't the destination. It was the beginning. I didn't want to lose her. That wasn't the restlessness. If anything, she grounded me more than anyone ever had. But I felt the pull again, the one that asked, "What now?" I was no longer defined by the affair that had almost ruined me, nor by the partner I had left, nor by the pain I had excavated. I had written it out, walked through it, grown past it. And now, standing on the other side, I wondered who I was outside the context of recovery. Who was I when I wasn't surviving? I began to write again, not about the past, but the future. Fiction this time. Entirely imagined. Characters with lives I'd never lived, in places I'd never been. And it felt exhilarating. I had been so tethered to my own story for so long that letting go of it, finally, but truly, felt like freedom. Elise noticed the change, of course. She always did. One evening, as we sat curled on the couch, she looked at me and said, "You're drifting a little, but not away from me, I think. Just into yourself." I nodded. "Does that scare you?" She shook her head. "No. I think that's exactly where you're supposed to go now." That's the kind of love she gave me. The kind that didn't tighten its grip when things shifted, but opened wider. Made room, encouraged expansion. And I realized in that moment that this was the purest form of love I had ever experienced. Not because it demanded nothing, but because it trusted everything. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision, one I hadn't anticipated. I applied for a 6-month writing residency overseas. An opportunity that had appeared in my inbox like a dare from the universe. It was in a small coastal town in Ireland, a place I'd never been, where writers were invited to stay in solitude and write without distraction. When I told Elise, I expected hesitation, sadness, maybe even resistance. But she simply smiled. "Then go," she said. "Write the story you haven't written yet." And just like that, it was settled. The weeks leading up to my departure were bittersweet. We spent more time together. Long walks, late night talks, a weekend trip to the cabin she'd once described on that train. We didn't pretend it would be easy. We didn't make hollow promises. We simply agreed to hold space for one another, even from afar. To remain present, even in absence. The day I left, she gave me a small envelope. "Open it when you get there," she said. I arrived in the small Irish village after a long journey of trains, flights, and winding roads. The residency cottage was perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, with creaking wooden floors and a fireplace that smelled of history. It was quiet, isolated, and perfect. I unpacked slowly, taking in the silence like a sacrament, and then I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter handwritten in her steady, looping script. "Ah, my love, if you're reading this, you've already chosen yourself, and I couldn't be prouder. You once told me that love, real love, doesn't save you, it sees you. And I hope you feel seen now. Not for your pain or your past, but for your becoming. I don't know where these 6 months will take you or what you'll uncover. But I do know this, I'm here. Not waiting, not holding my breath. Just here. Wherever your path leads, I'm rooting for you. Always, don't love, Elise." I read it 3 times, tears blurring the edges. Then I placed it in my notebook and sat at the desk by the window. The sea crashed below, wild and rhythmic, a lullaby of something eternal. And I began to write. Not about her, not about the past. About a man who leaves everything behind and discovers that home was never a place or a person. It was a version of himself he had forgotten, a version that dared to begin again. The months passed in waves. Some days I wrote for hours. Others I barely touched the page. But I was alive in every one of them. I swam in the cold ocean, drank whiskey with locals, got lost in forests, laughed louder than I had in years. And with each day, I felt myself loosening, shedding the last layers of an identity built on grief and guilt. I thought often of Elise, of course. We wrote letters, slow and thoughtful, sometimes weeks apart. No daily texts, no calls, just words when they were true. And in that distance, something beautiful happened. I stopped needing her to complete me. And in that space, I realized I loved her more fully than I ever had anyone. When the residency ended, I returned home, not to the same apartment. I had given it up before leaving, but to a new city, one closer to her. We met at a small cafe, just as we had planned, no fanfare. She walked in wearing that same quiet presence I had fallen in love with, and when she saw me, her eyes lit up, not with relief or desperation, but recognition. I stood. She walked into my arms, and for a long moment, we just held each other. Later, over coffee, I told her about the novel I had finished, the one I didn't expect to write. She told me about a community garden she had helped design. We laughed at how much had changed, how much hadn't. Then she said something I'll never forget. "You know, I wasn't sure you'd come back." I looked at her, steady. "I didn't come back," I came forward. She smiled. "Even better." And that was the real ending, not of our story, but of the one I had carried for so long. The story of betrayal, regret, and emotional ruin. That chapter was closed now, fully. Finally, we walked out into the evening together, the world buzzing with life, the air full of possibility. And as we walked hand in hand, I thought of all the versions of myself I had been: the man who lied, the man who ran, the man who lost, the man who grieved, the man who healed. But now, I was simply the man who chose to stay open, chose to keep growing, chose to love without losing himself. And that, I realized, was the twist I never saw coming. After everything, I wasn't broken. I was free.